God and his dream of America having been opposed since the eddies and cross-currents of between wars by Philistine tradition, against which Grant Wood and Sinclair Lewis had thought to wield an ironic scalpel. There is a character in spectacles. Babbitt's spectacles had huge circular frameless lenses of the very best glass. The earpieces were thin bars of gold. In them he was the modern businessman, one who gave orders to clerks and drove a car and played occasional golf and was scholarly in regard to salesmanship. With respect you beheld him put on the rest of his uniform as solid citizen. Yet what is such an art mocking but its own limitations, its consanguinities? Picasso's mandibled bather voiced the same desiccation more radically. It was just the translation of worn-out content into the elemental charge of distilled abstraction that gave international modernism its hard vitality. So Copland, with less acclaim, in the hermetic experiment of the 1930 piano variation. Meanwhile, the counter-drive, this 1929 Curry, pushed sanity in art and reattachment to nature and man, to avoid what Marsh called fantastic nonsense, and Benton of Missouri, sickly rationalizations, psychic inversions, and god-awful cultivations. Life magazine and the WPA helped. Copeland, too, as if to show that a clever man can change styles like dress, led music on the tabloid tack. Typical of the aesthetic war that when Barnett Newman in 1942 attacked isolationist painting, which they named the American Renaissance, not an art but an expanded Currier and Ives revival, he identified it with Hitlerism. Art in America today stands at a point where anything that cannot fit into the American scene label is doomed to be completely ignored, an ever-expanding school of genre painters telling the story of America's life of humdrum. Instead of the old oaken bucket, it based its appeal on the hurricane cellar. Though in a short time, while the synthesizer, here Subotnik, gained in music, the work of Newman himself, this two-lined color ground called Concord, based on the European abstract, but rapturously, almost, strange as the word seems, organically new. The mystic color pools of Rothko, action swirls of de Kooning and Pollock, with numberless variants of other experimentors, all that had pushed the representational in turn almost to the wall. Had reattachment been an eddy in the always remoter flight from things of the earth, or is it a recurrent calling? Dylan Thomas, at any rate, began 1934 with Estrangement, surreal as this Max Ernst, The Eye of Silence. Light breaks where no sun shines, where no sea runs, the waters of the heart push in their tides, and broken ghosts with glowworms in their heads, the things of light, file through the flesh, where no flesh decks the bones. But by 1946, the rapture of Fern Hill, Down Rivers of the Windfall Alight, or of Poem in October, suggests an art as immediate in earth praise as the Irish landscapes of Jack Yeats, painter brother of William Butler Yeats, the poet. It was my 30th year to heaven, woke to my hearing from harbour and neighbour wood, and the mussel pooled and heron priested shore the morning beckon, and I rose in rainy autumn and walked abroad in a shower of all my days. Did even Mondrian in wartime New York follow the trend of Earth Ye to the jazzing of his squares in what he called Broadway boogie-woogie, catchy as Cummings' take-off on First Love as driving a car? She being brand new, and consequently a little stiff, I was careful of her, and having thoroughly oiled the universal joint, tested my gas, felt of her radiator, made sure her springs were okay, I went right to it, flooded the carburetor, cranked her up, slipped the clutch. Just as we turned the corner of Divinity Avenue, I touched the accelerator and give her the juice good. It was the first ride, and believe we was happy to see how nice she acted. Right up to the last minute, coming back down by the public gardens, I slammed on the internal expanding and external contracting brakes both at once and brought all of her trembling to a dead standstill. The left had begun avant-garde, iconoclastic in art as in politics. Moseloff's 1928 Machine Music communizes this 1924 Honegger Pacific 231. But the populist rallying, even as it absorbed the radical, veered in counter-revolt against it. In a Mexico which called itself Marxist, Diego Rivera with others forged abstract into realism, satire into proletarian acclaim. Meanwhile, left and right enforced totalitarian conformity. One was tempted to divide Western civilization into three overlapping spans. First, the mystico-ascetic or medieval. Second, the free humanist, rising from that ground to Renaissance vigor, 17th century formulation, 18th and 19th century climax, with orgies of lacerative individualism extending into this century. Third, the ordered materialist, growing from the Industrial Revolution to the state assertions of our time. From the pragmatic perspective of this third, what was the whole surreal and abstract wave but a bourgeois pathology? As from the flight of symbolist vision, the mass hardening was a reactionary pathos of between wars. Against its blatancy stands the wonder of the ultimate modern. Rilke's last Duino elegy, the 10th, gleaming as far as its stars of the land of pain, Die Sterne des Leitlands, over the art scene. What can we do but invoke it again, and with it also the music its death-molting claims, Berg's Violin Concerto, which brings the sensory renewal of the 30s to a like transcendence. It was before the First War, and in the vein of rapt wonder Kokoschka approached in that Austria, that Rilke received the first 15 lines ending, "We wasters of sorrows, wir Vergeuder der Schmerzen, though they are nothing else than our winter foliage, our somber evergreen, place and settlement, camp, soil, and dwelling." When the poet, in the trough of between wars, found his way back to these elegies begun at Duino, the 10th had become a surreal pilgrimage. How strange, alas, are the streets of the city of pain. Franz Marc, having fallen in the great bloodletting, Who could advance with Rilke out through the wide landscape of laments, die weite Landschaft der Klagen? Clay, as much as anyone, plumbed the subconscious. But can Clay's clever miniatures hear Mount Niesen behind the Lake of Thun, match Berg's Requiem for Manon Gropius, much less Rilke's Ascent with the Early Dead? In silence, the elder lament brings him as far as the gorge, where it gleams in the moonlight, there, the source of joy. It was Clay's miraculous inventions which had mediated the 1920 change in Kandinsky. Surely there is a proportionality between the pre-war and post-war styles in Kandinsky and Rilke. The apocalyptic storm by which Kandinsky turns his 1913 flood disaster to a color vortex of earth-swallowing spirit matches the 1912 stratum of the 10th elegy, that secret weeping may blossom, dass das unscheinbare Weinen blühe, hearts looser, night surrender to the inconsolable sister's loosened hair. While when Kandinsky comes through Dada, Clay, and Bauhaus to the ethereal geometry of this 1926 several circles, it is as if Berg had brought Bach's Es ist genug out of a 12-tone agony, or Rilke under Pain Ranges had found the well of joy. Withal she names it, says among men, it's a carrying stream. Bei den Menschen ist sie ein tragender Strom. So the close of the Berg, like the Rilke, up heights seeded with catkins and the spring rain, climbs the vanishing diapason to the emotion that almost startles when happiness falls, die uns beinahe bestürzt, wenn ein glückliches fällt.
Самоподобен глаз старий, домі прапор.
It is of crucial significance that the materialist nation of the future, Russia, should have remained so long immersed in the Slavic appropriation of Byzantine. This 1508 Kremlin chapel, an orthodoxy 19th century Slavophiles must turn into an earth might, even to the passionate harmonization of all ancient chant. Against so national a mystique, how could Marx say the working men have no country? In the romantic westernization of that Russia, this portrayed Pushkin, sad singer of autumn, sweet mournful days, lure of leave-taking eyes, is also the prophet a six-winged seraph gave in the waste, eagle eyes, ears to hear the spheres, and the green vine in the valley climbing, for his own lying tongue that of the wise serpent, and for his human heart a coal of fire. So he wakes to the voice of God, wander the grey seas and earth roads, and burn men's hearts with this, my word. Was it then that he called to the mine prisoners of Siberia, "The walls will crumble at a word, and brothers, give you back the sword"? In the avant-garde revolt of the first quarter of this century, Russians leapt to the fore, though most, like Kandinsky and Stravinsky, lived abroad. Not Malevich, whose break with representation kept pace from year to year with Munich and Paris. With the exception of a brief stay in France, 1912, and in Germany, 1926, he stuck it out through war and revolution in Moscow. In this 1911 harvest scene, the observed puts on the barrels of cylindrical abstraction. In this 1913 Head of a Peasant Girl, Malevich moves under the impact of Picasso's cubism toward what he would formulate as a feeling for the absence of the object. By 1916, this complex of curved foldings had also yielded to a constructivism of plane geometry, culminating in the nuclear ultimate of suprematism. As Malevich wrote, "Suprematism compresses all of painting into a black square on a white canvas. I did not have to invent anything. It was the absolute night I felt in me. In that I perceived the creation, and I called it suprematism. It expresses itself in the black plane, in the form of a square." Though Diaghilev had observed in the cresting of 1905, "We are witnesses of a new and unknown culture, which will be created by us, and which will also sweep us away." While the revolution thought itself avant-garde, Malevich had art power in Russia. From Trotsky, "The mind of the artist will limp after the reality the politicians are creating." To Stalin, reaction hardened. Was it the outrage of that Internationale, where ground and trees were painted in loud geometries? When Malevich died in 1935, it was in poverty and neglect, his once Bolshevik attempt called bourgeois formalism. At what flaming acts, an inertia of art, that overthrow and changing of the tinctures connived. Here, a 1933 interrogation of two communists, with Shostakovich and Sholokhov. Bravely, proudly lifting his head, Potyelkov mounted the stool beneath the noose, unbuttoned the collar around his stout, swarthy neck, and without the tremor of a muscle himself set the soapy rope. "See how few are left to look on at our death. You have been deceived. The revolutionary government will come, and you will see where the truth was. The finest sons of the gentle dawn you have laid in that hole." Let this picture from the year Hitler came to power exemplify the state realism Stalin also enforced. And only long after, with the literary underground we know of, paintings would appear of an avant-garde suppressed under Soviet conformity. This mosaic of disturbed faces by Filanov, Leningrad painter who died in 1941. Suddenly one would realize what one must have known before, that consciousness is like a gene pool. Post-traumatic civilizations may demand, resolve, but they cannot obliterate what has been experienced by the soul. It is a tribute to Shostakovich that in his experimental works, condemned or quietly withdrawn, we are hypnotized toward that other focus, as with the mysterious close of the disapproved Fourth Symphony. When Mussolini in 1923 popped out of the Pandora box among battered books and broken statues of the Eternal City, he did not look so green-faced as Peter Bloom would make him more than 12 years later. Lincoln Steffens, in fact, had thought him God's clarifying thunderbolt. "You're a correspondent," Mussolini had asked. "You saw the war." "Yes, and the peace, yes, and the revolution in Russia, yes. Well," he sneered, "did you learn anything? Listen, do you think now any of the things you thought before you saw the war, the peace, and the revolution?" But if that was God's thunderbolt, Steffens obscured the turning of God on himself. How futurist ecstatic rant and D'Annunzio's foaming poems, leagued with Mussolini and castor oil to make the trains run on time, might overshoot. Let us hear no more of the brotherhood, sisterhood, and other bastard relations of nations. All relations of nations are those of power. So darkening Europe under flying fortresses, since meanwhile a most inadequate representational painter, the Austrian Adolf Hitler, had concretized, and in the bitterness of German defeat and inflation, was deflecting his art from such paintings as this castle, dream madhouse he might have escaped from, to a Mein Kampf veering of socialist workers to the turgid right, as Dante had said of the wrathful portando dentro accidioso fumo. With the Dachau smoke of that strange incinerator, the pathos of moral rearmament and soul hardening would spread over Europe the fiercest realism of all. In The Genius of Victory by Vampa, another Adolf, everything from abstract and expressionist, Dada and surreal is forcibly reversed in the Charles Atlas imperative of totalitarian renewal, caricature of Nietzsche's call to higher living. A ruling race can only grow from terrible and violent beginnings. Where are the barbarians of the 20th century? If only the Germans could have claimed a monopoly of them. The tiger springs in the new year, us he devours. T.S. Eliot in Gerontion had voiced that cyclical coming. So the innumerable clanging wings and sailing to Byzantium of Yeats' war, civil war, and post-war tower. Even Picasso, though more socialist than Christian, has visibly rested his 1937 bombing of Guernica on a flood destruction from the Saint-Sever's apocalypse of 1050. So the wasteland had shaped for its age a mythology of earth sabotage. What is the city over mountains, cracks and reforms and bursts in the violet air, falling towers, Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London, unreal, to which the Second War would add Warsaw, Rotterdam, Dresden, and all the rest. Against the communist realism of Russia, Picasso's partisan testimony fragments space and abstracts emotion. From the first state of the Guernica below to the last above, human content, the redemptive pain of the warrior stretched out as if crucified, is calcined and suppressed. Yet in a pictography where perspective, foreshortening, chiaroscuro go under, force flames some Heraclitean inverse of negation. While the claimants of world order cranked up their rhetoric, Picasso locked horns with God in the whirlwind. Even so, programmatic message, Rilke's Hazel Catkins from the Dead Land, rooted far back in the revolutionary and romantic, Hölderlin's Weary the Winters, at the last comes corn, has shaped in the photographed second state of the painting above such a sun-rayed promise of grain from the warrior's raised fist. And although the symbolic arm was to disappear under the writhing horse, it is in the final state below that what had been the hand of a dead woman, long since painted out, would resurrect as a spray of flowers, Dante's So Long as Hope puts up a blade of green, Rilke's Heilkraut of the Fifth Elegy, his singing plant on the peaks of the heart. Leafing up from the clenched sword hand, it counters annihilation. So where the first war had ended in capitalist debunking, the second swelled through partisan alliance to a crusade of the peace-loving peoples, while Churchill's rhetoric of blood, sweat, and tears, and fight them on the beaches, fight them at sea, fight them in the air, revived the myth of heroic action. How fragile, in the waste of Eliot's West, I was neither at the hot gates, Thermopylae, nor fought in the warm rain. My house is a decayed house, I an old man, a dull head among windy spaces, and teach us to care and not to care, teach us to sit still, how vulnerable to my lie. Yet through the war and the decade after, down to the overflow of hippie wish, something extraordinary happened. The partisan crusade incredibly veered through the reversal of Cold War into new frontiers and the dream of free enterprise opulence. At the same time, those arts which had begun in Dada mockery expand the same techniques, this 1942 Miro, to visionary wonder. In Finnegan's Wake of 1939, Joyce led all artificers of transverbal myth. We who live under heaven, we of the clovery kingdom, we middle sins people have often watched the sky overreaching the land. We suddenly have a kind of a thing like all trailogged, then probably it resembles a pelvic or some kind, then props an acute-backed quadrangle with a slant off o' hanth the wench you may cuddler, lying with her Royal Irish upper shoes among the thick leaves. Signs are on of a mere by token that will still to be becoming upon this there once a here was world, as the day o' Lavis unfolding them in the wake of the black shape. At the same time, the Turkish-Armenian immigrant Gorky, up to his accident and suicide, had seized on and was melting down the abstract and the surreal extremes of avant-garde, crashing through about 1941 to a subconscious plasticity of paint-fused canvas, drips and all, as it has been called, a phenomenology